In 1935, in a secluded facility nestled deep within the forests of Germany, a young woman named Anna entered the doors of a place she thought would honor her as a patriot. She had never met the man who would father her child. He was an SS officer, chosen for his Aryan lineage. She had been chosen too, not for her mind, not for her love, but for her hips, her blood, her racial purity. Anna believed she was serving the fatherland, but in truth, she had become part of a machine designed not for freedom or dignity, but for reproduction, obedience, and control. What could drive millions of women to willingly sacrifice their bodies, their choices, and their identities for an ideology that saw them as little more than vessels? To understand this, we must go back to the very beginning, to a broken country, humiliated and stripped of pride after its defeat in World War I. Germany, in the early 1920s, was a nation bleeding from every wound, politically fragmented, economically devastated, and spiritually crushed by the Treaty of Versailles. And amidst the chaos, it was women who bore much of the weight. Many were widowed, others begged on the streets with starving children. Yet paradoxically, this era also brought unprecedented freedoms. In 1919, German women won the right to vote, decades before their counterparts in France or Italy. They entered the workforce, enrolled in universities, and for the first time claimed a place in public life. But these advances triggered a cultural backlash, a longing for the traditional woman, nurturing, passive, obedient. The masculine world, still reeling from defeat, needed something to hold on to. And that something would soon be promised by a man whose words dripped with vengeance, pride, and renewal: Adolf Hitler. He was not yet a dictator, just a voice rising in beer halls, weaving fantasies of national rebirth. But he understood something few others did. The soul of the German woman had been wounded just as deeply as that of the German man. And where men turned to violence and nationalism, women turned to hope. Hope that someone, anyone, could restore order, dignity, and meaning to a crumbling world. Hitler offered that hope. What makes a man see women as both sacred and inferior? To understand Hitler's twisted ideology of womanhood, we must first step into the quiet corners of his childhood home, a modest Austrian household dominated not by a father figure, but by women. His mother, Clara, was the emotional center of his early world. A gentle and devout woman, she adored her son with unshakable devotion. Adolf was her favorite, her miracle child, the only one of several siblings to survive. She called him Mein Schatzi, my little treasure, and shielded him from even the smallest discomfort. This affection left a deep imprint. For the rest of his life, Hitler spoke of Clara with reverence and longing. She became, in his mind, the archetype of womanhood, nurturing, self-sacrificing, and silent. The ideal woman was not a thinker, not a rebel, not a leader. She was a mother, a vessel, a quiet force in the background. And yet, surrounding young Adolf were not only maternal figures, but ones who idolized him. His older sister Paula was submissive and adoring. As a teenager, girls found him odd but charismatic. It was a world where he was rarely challenged by women, only elevated. So the question emerges: how does a boy raised in worship of the feminine become the architect of one of history's most repressive regimes for women? That contradiction became the foundation of Nazi gender policy. Decades later, as Hitler rose to power, this psychological imprint would resurface, not as gentle nostalgia, but as control. He spoke often of the 3 Ks: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. In his eyes, the true German woman was a mother first, a nationalist second, and a silent servant to her husband and the Reich. But even this framework was laced with contradiction. He demanded purity, yet fostered state-sponsored breeding programs like Lebensborn. He rejected female intellect in politics, yet used female loyalty as a key pillar in Nazi propaganda. And behind closed doors, his personal relationships revealed a darker pattern of dominance and emotional manipulation. Nowhere was this more visible than in his obsessive relationship with his half-niece, Geli Raubal. She was young, bright. After Geli, Hitler avoided emotional intimacy. His later companion, Eva Braun, was kept hidden from the public for over a decade. She was blonde, Catholic, obedient, and invisible. In private, she danced and laughed. In public, she didn't exist. And yet, not all women were content with silence. Let us return now to Greta, the fictional but emblematic girl we met before. At age 15, she was recruited into the BDM, the League of German Girls. To her, Hitler was not a dictator. He was the father of the nation. She kept his photo by her bedside, whispered his name like a prayer. Greta believed in the myth that German women had a noble purpose, to birth and raise a superior race. But slowly, she began to notice the cracks. Why were girls discouraged from reading too much? Why were they pushed into marriage at 17, motherhood by 18? Why were women punished for ambition, but praised for obedience? And why, despite all the talk of dignity and honor, did she feel more like property than patriot? These questions would shape Greta's journey and echo the silent doubts of millions of women across the Reich. Because in Hitler's Germany, femininity was not celebrated, it was engineered. By the time Greta turned 16, the image of the ideal German woman had been carved into every wall, poster, and school book in the country. She didn't need to question her role. It had already been written for her. She stood in rows, uniform crisp, hair braided. With hundreds of other girls, she saluted the flag, sang patriotic songs, and swore loyalty not to her parents nor to her teachers, but to the Führer. This was the BDM, Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls. It was more than a youth organization, it was a machine designed to mold teenage girls into something precise, healthy, devoted, and fertile. They were drilled in physical training, hiking, gymnastics, even mock military discipline. But beneath the athleticism was something far more powerful: ideological indoctrination. Greta was taught that her body belonged to the Reich, that motherhood was the highest honor, that every child she bore was a soldier in the making, a step closer to Hitler's racial utopia. They called her a guardian of the nation's future. But in truth, she was being prepared for submission. And she wasn't alone. Her best friend, Lotta, shared the same dreams. But while Greta was selected for regional leadership training, Lotta was sent somewhere else. A quiet villa hidden in the woods, with iron gates and spotless white halls. This was Lebensborn. On paper, it was a maternity home, a sanctuary for unwed mothers. In reality, it was one of the Third Reich's most chilling experiments in social engineering. Lotta had been chosen, not for her ideas or her talents, but for her genes. Blonde hair, blue eyes, hips wide enough for childbirth. She was paired anonymously with an SS officer. They never spoke. He arrived, fulfilled his duty, and left.
I know what you mean. We're all here for you.
The child she bore would be raised by the state, pure Aryan, without the burden of a mother's attachment. She was praised for her service, but inside she felt hollow. The Nazis had rewritten the meaning of motherhood, no longer a bond of love and nurture. It had become an act of war. Outside, in the streets, the same message echoed through every form of propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's Minister of Propaganda, once declared, "The German woman is the heart of the nation." It sounded noble, but in practice, it meant only one thing. Women were tools to breed, to serve, to stay beautiful, silent, and strong. Films showed smiling mothers with perfect children. Posters portrayed glowing young women under the sun, framed by slogans like, "You are Germany." The ideal woman was cheerful, athletic, modest, and utterly devoted. She was not allowed to think too much, not allowed to lead, not encouraged to question. When Greta began asking quiet questions about Lotte, about the strange policies no one explained, her instructor warned her, "Doubt is un-German." So Greta smiled, marched, and kept her thoughts to herself, but the cracks had begun to show. Behind every slogan of purity was a system of coercion. Behind every poster of health and beauty was a woman robbed of her choice. And behind every public salute was a silent question, growing louder. If this is
Just know
dignity,
that we are all
why does
here
it
for
feel
you.
like control? By 1942, the streets of Germany no longer echoed with triumphant marches and cheerful salutes. The parades had thinned. The smiles had faded. The posters remained, now peeling under the weight of bombs and ration lines. And Greta, once the proud daughter of the Reich, stood among smoke and silence. She was 21 now. The uniform still fit, but the fire in her eyes had dulled. She no longer sang the songs. She no longer whispered Hitler's name at night. What had once felt like purpose now felt like betrayal. She had lost someone.
Went along with
His
them.
name was Lucas, a childhood friend turned lover, a soldier on the Eastern Front. The last letter she received from him spoke of snow, hunger, and the cold stare of death. 2 weeks later, she was notified of his heroic sacrifice. Greta didn't cry, not right away, because even grief had become political. Mothers, sisters, wives, all were expected to mourn with pride, not sorrow. He died for Germany. You must be proud. But pride didn't keep the bed warm. It didn't fill the silence. It didn't answer the question that gnawed inside her. Why? With more and more men dying or vanishing into distant battlefields, women were pulled from the hearth and thrust into the factories. Greta, like thousands of others, traded her BDM badge for a pair of work gloves. She was assigned to an arms plant, 12-hour shifts assembling ammunition in dimly lit halls. The air stank of oil and sweat. Her hands blistered, her lungs ached. And yet, there was no glory here, no parades for factory girls. Many women resented the work, not just for its brutality, but because it clashed with everything they had been taught. They were promised sacred roles as mothers and homemakers. Now, they were cogs in an industrial war machine. Some preferred the soldier's wife allowance, a modest pension paid to widows or waiting wives. It wasn't much, but it bought dignity. Labor, in contrast, felt like surrender. Meanwhile, food grew scarce. Queues snaked around bakeries at dawn. Soap, shoes, even milk for children became luxuries. Mothers scraped crusts into pots and told their kids to chew slowly. At night, the sirens screamed. Cities were bombed. Fires danced across rooftops like devils. Greta learned to sleep in air raid shelters, clutching a photograph, praying for silence. The Reich, which once promised order and purpose, had delivered only chaos and fear. Still, the propaganda didn't stop. Posters urged women to stay strong. Radio broadcasts praised their heroic sacrifice. But inside, many felt abandoned, manipulated, and expendable.
Struggle for survival.
Greta remembered the slogans. You are the heart of the nation. Every child you bear is a victory. But what of the children who died in bombings? What of the women who bore no child but broke their backs in factories? What of the hearts now empty, shattered, unrecognized? The war had revealed the great lie. The promise of dignity had been a leash. And now, as blood soaked the soil of Europe, the women of the Reich were awakening, not with fury, but with quiet, exhausted despair. Greta no longer looked up when she passed Hitler's portrait. She had given him her youth, her love, her labor. All he gave her in return was loss. When the war ended, the world saw the ruins, flattened cities, hollowed churches, and blood-soaked fields. But buried beneath the rubble was something less visible. A generation of women who had survived the Reich and now lived with the weight of its collapse. Greta was among them. She returned to her hometown, or what was left of it, with calloused hands, hollow eyes, and no one waiting for her. Her father had died in an air raid. Her brother never returned from the front. Lucas, the boy she once loved, remained only in memory. And then there was the child she never had, the one she once imagined raising in a proud German household. That dream had died somewhere between the factory floor and the screams of falling bombs. Across Germany, women like Greta wandered the wreckage, not just of buildings, but of belief. Some had served the regime with quiet devotion. Others had been swept along by fear, by hope, by propaganda too seductive to resist. But now, none of it mattered. The Reich had crumbled, the Führer was dead, and history had already begun choosing its villains and victims. The women? They were told to forget, to bury the shame, to move on. But the past didn't vanish. It lived on, in the eyes of children born in Lebensborn homes, whose origins had been erased, in the women who had been raped during the Soviet occupation and silenced by their own communities, in the Polish mothers whose children were taken by SS doctors and never returned. It lived on in the trauma, silent, unspoken, buried deep. Some women couldn't bear the weight. Depressions swept through post-war Germany like another invisible war. Suicide rates among women, especially war widows and those in former Nazi institutions, rose sharply. Many felt like ghosts in their own country. Their names weren't written in textbooks. Their photos didn't appear in memorials. History remembered the generals, the camps, the crimes, but the women who served, suffered, and survived? They became footnotes, or worse, pariahs. Yet not all remained silent. In the decades that followed, a small number of women began to speak, not to justify, but to reckon. They wrote memoirs, gave interviews. She wrote a letter, not to a publisher, not to a museum, but to her unborn daughter. I believed in something monstrous, because it wore the face of hope. I sang for a man who built ovens instead of futures. I let my silence become complicity, and now all I can do is remember. So you will not repeat. Her words were never printed, but they were passed on, quietly, carefully, like seeds buried deep, waiting for a future brave enough to grow from truth. The legacy of these women is not one of pride, it is one of reckoning. They remind us that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in lullabies, marches in uniform, and hides behind promises of safety and honor. And the lesson they leave is this: freedom is not a gift, it is a responsibility, one that must be questioned, protected, and earned, again and again. In the final days of the Third Reich, as Berlin collapsed into flames and the dream of a 1,000-year empire turned to ash, Eva Braun sat beside Adolf Hitler in a bunker beneath the city. She had been by his side for over a decade, invisible to the public, erased from the speeches, hidden behind curtains while the Führer addressed the nation. She was loyal, Aryan, devoted, yet even she was not deemed worthy of recognition. They married in the bunker. Hours later, they took their own lives. Their love story, if it can be called that, was never celebrated. It was never even truly acknowledged. Eva Braun, the woman closest to the most powerful man in Nazi Germany, was remembered not for who she was, but for being a footnote to his downfall. If even she could be erased, what about the others? What about the thousands of women who marched, worked, sang, bore children, or simply endured? What about the mothers who obeyed, the daughters who questioned, the friends who vanished into programs like Lebensborn? What about those who resisted, quietly, defiantly, whose names history never recorded? And what about Greta? She lived. She lived long enough to see the fall, the silence, and the slow, painful awakening of a nation. She lived through shame, through reckoning, through years of self-imposed exile from her past. But she also lived to tell the truth, not because she was proud, but because she knew silence would only grow more dangerous with time. Greta's story is not singular. It is symbolic. It is the story of a generation of women raised in lies, used as instruments, and then left behind in the dust of history. And yet, even now, not all their stories have been told. We know the names of the generals, we study the speeches, the strategies, the crimes. But in the shadows of that history stand women, millions of them, whose experiences remain unwritten, unspoken, unknown. Some bore the swastika with pride, some broke under its weight, some believed, some questioned, some disappeared, and now, decades later, we are left with a question. If memory is shaped by who gets to speak, how many truths have we never heard? Because perhaps the most haunting legacy of the women of the Reich is not what they did,